Hi, welcome back to the Biblical Preaching Podcast. And in this bite-sized episode, I want to ask a question or answer a question about the, I suppose, bite-sized nature of Bible texts. Let's say you've got a story that you're preaching from the Bible and it's just a few verses long. You can read it out loud in 30 seconds and yet you're going to preach for 30 minutes. How do you preach the text and not go beyond the text? Now, some people aren't concerned about this at all. Some people are very, very nervous of saying anything that isn't what the text says. Now, it's interesting, actually, that it seems that some preachers will happily talk about theology and their sort of theological constructions from a text, but they will hesitate to add any detail to the telling of the text. So what you can end up with is a narrative that is read out and then a sermon that is largely theological in nature, maybe sort of an overlay on top of the text. And so what do we do about that? We want to reflect and re-communicate the text as effectively as possible. Is it okay to say anything more than what the passage itself is saying? I have 5 thoughts on this that I just want to share with you. Hopefully this will be helpful. The first one is that there will be informing texts. So yes, your passage may be just a few verses long, but it's leaning on some other passages, either passages that are quoted within it, or passages that give you the background to what is being described in the story you're looking at. And so where there's a clear informing text, that gives you more Bible content to deal with. A quote means you can go back to the original context. You can read it. You can make sense of the passage you're in using that one. And so, informing texts are helpful. Then there's related texts. Now, I do think we should be careful with related texts. You know, you can look up other verses that say the same thing or use the same word as you find in your passage, and you can fill a message with other Bible text. But what's the point? Okay, so think about that every time you go to use another passage. What's the point of using this? Am I adding something? Am I, in a positive way, am I helping my message? Or am I just padding my message? Because if I'm padding my message by referring to several other passages that use similar language, actually what I'm achieving there is hiding my passage. I'm losing it. I'm obscuring it. And so there are reasons to go to other passages, related texts, when you're preaching. One would be to substantiate the truth of what your passage is saying if it seems unusual. But there's not a lot of reasons. Okay, you don't want to be jumping around to other passages and just losing the focus on your preaching passage. So there's informing texts upon which your passage relies. By all means, go to those. Then there are related texts that you're making the connection. Use those sparingly, use those carefully, prudently, wisely. But then there's a whole lot of assumed knowledge in your passage. Language like Sabbath, or geographical language, religious language, terminology that's being used, cultural language from the day. Whenever you preach a Bible story, there are details in it that the original readers would have understood implicitly because they lived in that world. But we don't. We live 2,000 or 3,000, depends where your passage is. We live thousands of years later in a different part of the world, speaking a different language with a different culture, different geography. And so it is perfectly legitimate to help people understand what is going on in the passage. What is the assumed knowledge? So when you're telling the story of your Bible narrative, help people to know, fill in the details, help them to understand. If the passage is set in Jerusalem and it's describing going down to the pool of Siloam, it's perfectly legitimate to describe what that is like. You have to learn it yourself, of course, but you can describe what it means to go to the pool of Siloam, or what it means to have a 5-roofed colonnade, or what it means to head to Bethany or whatever. So things that would have been perhaps first-hand knowledge to original readers of the text might need some extra explanation for your listeners. And so that is going to take more time. Your 30-second story is starting to become several minutes long simply from explaining what's going on. So you can use other passages carefully if they're not really strongly related or connected, but if they are directly connected and they're informing, use them. But within your passage, explain what's going on. Give people a sense of what it means. What is it expecting or assuming that will be created in your mind as you read it? As a preacher, you help people to create those images in the imaginations of your listeners. Now, speaking of imagination, that brings us to number 4. Sometimes we want to imagine some detail that we're not given. For example, what somebody's thinking in a story, or what's going on in the background of somebody's life. Now, if you are a fan of The Chosen, and you're watching The Chosen, you're seeing an incredible amount of backstory filled in for the 12 disciples. I find that fascinating. I think it's really interesting, but I don't preach it, right? I don't want to preach that Matthew had a certain condition. I don't want to preach about Peter's marriage and all the backstory that the Chosen's filled in. I think it's helpful to dramatize it, but when we're preaching it, we're preaching the text. We're not preaching a TV show or a movie. And so what can we do? What should we do? I was listening to a Haddon Robinson sermon recently, and in that sermon, it was on the Good Samaritan. At one point he said, I can imagine that he thought this. I don't know if he did, but we do. And so he took the sort of imagined description of back then as a launch point for application today. I think that's legitimate. I think that's perfectly okay, as long as you make it clear that you are imagining. Or maybe he said this. Perhaps this had gone on in the background. We don't know. But then drive people back to the text. There's nothing wrong with using a little bit of sanctified imagination, but drive people to the text to see what is there and help them to grasp what's going on. And then the final point that kind of balances that is that we should only assert what the text asserts. We don't want to build a little bit of imagination, an imaginary dialogue or an imaginary thought process, and then preach that as our point. That has no biblical divine authority. Use that to help people understand the passage. Use it sparingly, perhaps. Use it carefully, certainly. Help people to know when you're adding to the text that you know you're doing it and you're not claiming it's true. You're just thinking it through. But when it comes time to assert a point or to drive home an application, to make an assertion from your passage, make sure that it's an assertion that's in the text, one that they can look down and see with their own eyes in black and white on the page in front of them. Okay, so there's 5 thoughts on how we go from a 30-second Bible reading to a 30-minute or whatever sermon. How do we do that legitimately? And so we thought about informing texts. If there's a text in the background that helps to understand what's going on, by all means, use it. We've thought about related texts. We should be maybe a bit more careful not to just throw Bible passages together, and certainly we don't want to fill up our sermon with unnecessary extra quotations, but they can be used sparingly and wisely. We've thought about the assumed knowledge in the passage, that as a preacher, it's kind of our job to help people understand the geography, the culture, all of that kind of historical background. And then there's the issue of imagination, imagining thoughts and dialogue that may have taken place, backstory. There's legitimate use for that. Just be careful. Make sure that people know that you're guessing. And then make sure, finally, that what you're actually asserting, what you're preaching with authority, is what the text actually says. Let the text drive the message. I hope that's helpful. Now, you may have some other thoughts, maybe that churns some questions. Please comments. We love to get feedback and input on these things. Now, I was just thinking about this as I was running through these points. The story of Zacchaeus culminates in Luke 19, verse 10. The whole story of Zacchaeus is fascinating, and I've preached it quite a number of times. It's fascinating because it really points the reader's attention, the listener's focus, to little Zacchaeus and his desperate efforts to see Jesus. He can't get through the crowd. He runs on ahead. He climbs up into the tree. It seems to be all about Zacchaeus the seeker. And then you get to Luke 19, verse 10, and it says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost." It's a beautiful reversal. And as you tell the story of Zacchaeus, if you can tell it effectively, your listeners will be focused completely on Zacchaeus and then surprised that actually the story is about Jesus. He's the one that's seeking. He's the one that's come on a mission ultimately to rescue sinners like Zacchaeus. And of course, there's a great rescue that takes place at that tree. It's a really interesting passage. But actually, isn't that the story of the whole Bible? That the Son of Man came to seek and to save. The whole incarnation, the fact that Jesus entered into our world as a human, walking on our roads, our streets, experiencing our food, obviously in that culture, but he lived in our world in order to engage us, in order to reveal God to us, and in order ultimately to rescue us. And so, Luke 19, verse 10, the whole of the Bible just makes me appreciate the power of story, the power of narrative. The Son of Man came to seek and to save. He entered our world. And so as we preach, let's make sure that whatever narrative we're preaching, or poem, or discourse, whatever Bible passage we're preaching, let's make sure that we communicate it as effectively as possible, engaging the imaginations of our listeners so that they're not getting a sort of dry presentation of facts or theological truths, but they're experiencing the passage. They're entering into the text, and the text is entering into them, because that's how story works. That's how God has given us an incarnated message in the person of Jesus and in the written word. It's in the flesh. It's there for us to imagine. It's there for us to experience. Praise God that he came into our world to seek and to save us. And so as we preach to others, let's be sure that whatever skill we can use, whatever preaching capacity we have, let's do our best to present the text, to represent the text, so that our listeners can imagine it, they can see it, they can enter into it, and it can enter into them. Thanks so much for watching, listening. However you've engaged this content, thanks for being with us on the Biblical Preaching Podcast.
Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate every positive review, like, share, and comment. And thank you for praying for us. We hope you will join us again next time on the Biblical Preaching Podcast.